On the 23rd of May 1994, a freak storm rolled into Perth. Accompanied by heavy thunder and sharp forks of lightning, the 90-mile-per-hour winds wreaked havoc on the city. At 6:15 p.m, Peter Lawrence was growing concerned about his wife. She was late home from work. After failed attempts to call her, he made his way down to her jewellery shop where he was met with a harrowing sight. His wife, lying in a pool of blood, clinging on to life. Hello and welcome to the Little Shop of Crime. I'm Steve if you're new here. For those of you who aren't, I know I've not been able to upload quite as regularly recently. Life stuff. So I tried to find a simpler case to research. Turns out this wasn't it. As I dug deeper into the meat of it, I realised it just kept unfolding into a tale of murder, deceit and tragedy. But it's a story worth telling. So let's investigate. This is the murder of Pamela Lawrence. Today's story takes us back to the Southern Hemisphere in our second case in Australia. But this time we are hitting Western Australia, where you'll find the usual Aussie tropes. Kangaroos and didgeridoos and chazwazzers. But you'll also find the city of Perth, the state's capital. 2.1 million people live in this compact coastal metropolis, which is one of the most isolated major cities in the world. Head away from there and you won't hit another big city for over 1,300 miles. In fact, Perth is closer to Jakarta than it is to Sydney. I won't give you the full geography lesson, so here's a quick rundown of what makes Perth, Perth. The Swan River, craft beers, sunsets, unique wildlife, wine, golf, 19 white sand beaches, night markets, surfing, and seemingly never-ending blue skies. With an average of 268 at least partly sunny days a year, it's one of the sunniest capital cities on Earth. But not on this day. On Monday, May 23rd, 1994, a freak storm tore into Western Australia. Torrential rain caused flash flooding and 90-mile-per-hour winds uprooted trees, peeled away roofs and wrestled with power lines, causing a widespread blackout and damage in excess of 37 million Australian dollars in 1994 money. It doesn't just add an ominous backdrop to this case. It provided an important memory peg for alibis and witnesses who remembered where they were during the chaos. In the affluent suburb of Mosman Park, shops were closing early on Glyde Street, a popular thoroughfare punctuated with bohemian boutiques and cafes, but one of its shops remained open. Pamela Lawrence had been a theatre nurse for 20 years before she decided on a career change and opened her own quirky little shop, Flora Metallica. It wasn't your traditional jewellery shop. It sold eclectic pieces Pamela made from leaves, nuts and other organic materials that she encased in precious metals. At the time, she was 45 years old, in a happy and stable 23-year marriage with Peter Lawrence, and together they lived just a few minutes from the shop, with their two daughters, Katie and Amy. By all accounts, Pamela was popular in the Mosman Park area, well-respected and charismatic. It's a cliché, I know, but she was described as the sort of person who could light up a room, certainly not someone who had any mortal enemies. Pamela spent most of this day working in a small shed behind the store where she had a makeshift workshop. A friend and employee, Jacqueline Barsden, manned the shop itself until the end of her shift at 3 p.m. She said her goodbyes to Pamela, left and locked the door behind her, while Pamela continued working out back alone. It was unlikely any customers would wander in given the weather anyway. Pamela would usually arrive home between 5:30 and 6 p.m. So when 6:15 came with no sign of her, Peter called the shop to see when she'd be back. There was no answer. Growing anxious, he made his way there. When he pulled up, it was clear that Flora Metallica hadn't been closed for the evening. The light was on and an advertising board was still outside. He unlocked the door and carried it inside, where he was met with strange gurgling sounds coming from behind the counter. And there at 6:30 p.m, he made the awful discovery. His wife, with horrific head injuries, lying in a pool of blood. Peter placed a cloth over her head wounds, put her in the recovery position and dialed 000 at 6:37 p.m. She was stretchered away and paramedics did all they could, but Pamela succumbed to her injuries en route to the hospital, where she was pronounced dead on arrival at 7:15 p.m. By the time police arrived, the storm had caused a blackout in the Mosman Park area, which meant the crime scene couldn't be properly examined until the following morning. No murder weapon was found, nor was any significant DNA, and at first it seemed as though robbery was an unlikely motive. None of the jewellery was taken, diamonds were left untouched, and a box of cash clearly visible behind the counter was left undisturbed. The only thing stolen was Pamela's purse from inside her handbag. Blood pattern analysis indicated that Pamela had been struck near the front of her shop before being dragged to the rear and repeatedly struck again. A detailed search unearthed a number of fingerprints, but they all belonged to staff and emergency responders. The only real clue they found at the crime scene was a partial palm print. This was significant because the cabinets were wiped down multiple times every day, so it placed its owner there recently. But back then there was no print recognition system available for palms, so it was stored as evidence for later. Pamela's autopsy was conducted the following day. The cause of death was head injuries following at least 12 blows to the skull with an unknown blunt object, which left a peculiar crescent pattern. There were no defensive injuries, so it was likely she'd been taken by surprise. But her head injuries did yield a second important clue. In 7 of the 12 lacerations, the murder weapon had left behind microscopic fragments of a blue material, and a forensic chemist was able to determine it was Prussian blue enamel paint. The lead detective assigned to the case was Mal Sherville, assisted by Detective David Capon. And the morning after the murder they got their first lead. It came from Catherine Barsden, the 13-year-old daughter of Jacqueline, Pamela's employee. On the evening of the murder, she'd been picked up from school by her grandmother, and their car happened to stop at traffic lights right outside Flora Metallica. She looked into the window and was surprised at what she saw. A man standing behind the counter alone, where customers wouldn't ordinarily be. She made eye contact with the man, who immediately ducked out of sight. He didn't reappear before the lights changed and the car moved on. She made note of the time on its clock, 5:02 p.m. From Catherine's description of the man, a facial composite was sketched. He was described as being white, about 6 feet tall, with a light beard and wearing a bandana. This sketch was widely distributed in the local area and on news channels in Perth, as police urged any witnesses to come forward. And Pamela's murder was big news in the area. In response to the public appeal, a huge number of people nominated potential persons of interest, and before long police had a list of 136 potential suspects. One such suspect was Peter Lawrence. In all murder cases, a spouse is automatically considered a person of interest, particularly in cases where they're the ones who found the body, but Pamela's husband was pretty quickly ruled out. The pathologist and blood pattern analyst both determined that Pamela was bludgeoned quite some time before she was discovered, while Peter was still at home with one of his daughters. He later told police that he thought a Sid Chrome wrench might have been missing from the workshop. One by one, police interviewed and crossed off the people on their list, most of whom were able to provide evidence of their whereabouts on that stormy evening. They began knocking on the doors of residents who lived on or just off Glyde Street. 3 days after Pamela's murder, they arrived at the door of a 23-year-old woman, Michelle, who lived in this apartment block just a few minutes' walk from Flora Metallica. It was there that police were given the name Andrew Mallard. Andrew was born in England in 1962 to parents Roy and Grace Mallard, who already had a 10-year-old daughter, Jackie. The Mallard family moved to Perth in 1967 when Andrew was 5 years old. By the time he went to school, he was unusually tall for his age, and he struggled to fit in. Kids would tease him about his accent and height, and this developed into bullying that even turned physical at times. High school was even worse, and he left at 16 with no real prospects or ambitions. At 18, he was unemployed and hitting the Perth nightclub scene pretty hard. He was now a 6.5-foot tall adult, drinking heavily and smoking pot every day. When he turned 20, he made an attempt to follow in his father's footsteps and join the army, where he spent 8 months training, but again he struggled to fit in. He wasn't cut out for military life and was conveniently discharged due to a mild sleeping disorder. After the army came a string of short-term jobs, before he briefly returned to England and then back over to Australia again. He just couldn't maintain a settled life and never felt like he belonged wherever he was. In a deep depression by his late 20s, Andrew was barely able to leave the house due to crippling anxiety. At one point, he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Regular therapy sessions helped and eventually gave him the confidence to move out of his parents' home. But in 1994, his mental health had declined once again. He was 31 years old, homeless and broke. Too proud to ask his family for help, he sold his watch and jewellery to get by, and formed a habit of latching on to people. He'd persuade them to let him stay with them in exchange for any cannabis he could get his hands on. His behaviour grew more and more erratic. He was receiving social security payments but also committing petty thefts and the occasional scams to get by. He was a fantasist conman who lived off his wits, but he was riddled with delusions. He claimed to be able to speak 6 languages and even that he was a re-embodied Viking warrior. In the lead up to Pamela's murder, Andrew had a number of minor convictions, mostly just traffic offences and 2 for theft, but he had no history of violence. It was on May 15th, about a week before Pamela was killed, that he befriended Michelle Engelhardt, the woman who'd given Andrew's name to police as a possible suspect. He was able to persuade her to let him sleep on a mattress in her lounge. At the time, she was unemployed and a persistent drug user. She knew him as Andre, another of his lies. It wasn't long before Andrew had outstayed his welcome though, and Michelle repeatedly asked him to leave, but he managed to extend his stay in exchange for small amounts of cannabis, and by somehow convincing her that he was an undercover officer working for Interpol. But Michelle wasn't the only one who'd given Andrew's name to the detectives on this case. Another officer did, because of Andrew's actions the day before and the day after the murder. Michelle had been pressuring Andrew to leave, and he made a bid to impress her. She'd told him her ex-boyfriend owed her some money, and so on the night before the murder, Andrew went over to his place where he broke in and stole a bicycle and a leather jacket. The ex-boyfriend was quick to point police in the direction of Michelle, and the following morning, the day of the murder, they came knocking and Andrew was arrested. During questioning, the officer briefly left the room, and Andrew helped himself to a police badge and a tie-pin without being seen. When the interview finished, he was granted bail and released from East Perth lockup at 3:47 p.m. After some delay, he eventually found a taxi and directed its driver to Mosman Park, close to Michelle's apartment. But Andrew had no intention of paying. He told the driver he was going to grab some people so they could all continue the journey onto Fremantle, but he did a runner. The driver waited about 20 minutes before he accepted the loss and took another fare. The taxi company record showed this to be at 5:22 p.m. Michelle and another flatmate provided statements saying that Andrew didn't arrive back at her apartment until 6:30 p.m. This was shortly after the time Pamela was attacked. Naturally, police were keen to speak with Andrew, but he was no longer staying with Michelle. He was actually at Greylands Psychiatric Hospital, having been remanded there for a mental health assessment. But why? Well, the very day after the murder, Andrew was yet again arrested for theft. But this time he was also charged with impersonating a police officer as well. Using the bicycle he'd stolen from Michelle's ex, Andrew cycled to a convent, where he'd nicked a chalice the previous week. Using the badge and tie-pin he took from the police station, he approached a nun, presenting himself as a detective investigating the theft of the chalice. You couldn't make it up, could you? It seems the nun wasn't buying it. She contacted police and Andrew made a hasty escape and ended up at St Hilda's Anglican Girls' School, where he then attempted to steal a bag but was spotted. So he made his way back to Michelle's apartment where police again arrested him, charged him with the chalice theft and impersonating a police officer. On recognising the persistent irrational behaviour, he was remanded to Greylands Hospital for 3 weeks for psychiatric assessment. There he was diagnosed as suffering from a hypomanic phase of a bipolar mood disorder, and his cognition was deemed to be intact but his overall social judgment impaired. Whilst at the hospital, Andrew was interviewed by Detective Sergeant Capon in the presence of a nurse on 4 separate occasions. When asked where he was at the time of the murder, Andrew told the detective that he'd taken a taxi from the police station to Michelle's home and arrived in Mosman Park at about 5 p.m. This was corroborated with the taxi company. But remember, Michelle had told Detective Capon that Andrew hadn't arrived home until around 6:30 p.m. This left a suspicious gap of around an hour and a half that Andrew's whereabouts were unknown, the time Pamela was murdered. Naturally, the detective was keen to know his movements during that 90-minute window. Andrew consistently denied any involvement with the murder. He gave numerous differing accounts and offered the name of friends he'd visited during that time, but each alibi was dismissed when police interviewed the witness he nominated, all of whom denied being with him that evening. It seems that no one could account for exactly where Andrew was at the time Pamela was killed. Andrew was discharged from the hospital on June 10th. Hours after leaving, he was hauled in for a 9-hour police interview with Detective Capon, with no legal aid. The interview wasn't recorded other than notes taken by a second detective. According to these notes, Andrew was asked 15 times what had occurred after leaving the taxi and getting back to Michelle's apartment. He gave a variety of contradictory explanations before he admitted he was confused and simply didn't know. Detective Capon put it to Andrew that he may have been responsible for Pamela's murder, but he vehemently denied being involved. The questioning continued, and eventually Andrew broke down, started crying, and began speaking in the third person. I know there was a lot of all blanks. He was very scared. He didn't want to get caught. He was evil. The person that did this thing, it was evil. He was scared. He just kept on hitting her. He couldn't stop. At this point, Andrew was formally cautioned and read his rights, but he continued. He murdered her. He's very scared. He doesn't want to get caught. This person, the evil person, I don't know his name, just looking to steal something. Just something to get by. Back door. Up the stairs to the back door. She was locking up. She saw him. He was very scared he was going to get caught. He hit her and kept on hitting her. She put her hands up like this. What did he hit her with, Andrew? A wrench. He couldn't let her tell anybody. He was very scared. He saw a girl in a car. She saw him. He had to get out. He was very scared. Can't get caught. There's a lot of blanks. Just blanks. He had to move her so no one could see. To the back door. He dragged her. There was blood everywhere. She was still making noises, gurgling. He hit her again. After he moved her, he wanted to get away. I ran out the back. He had to go. There's just blanks. There's blanks. He was very scared. Where did he get the wrench from? A shed. Out the back there's a shed. A wrench. And where is the wrench now? North Fremantle. He threw it in the ocean. Andrew, when you talk about this person, this evil person, are you talking about yourself? No, this evil person is not me. Shortly after this, Andrew became hysterical. He bit Detective Capon on the inner thigh, and the interview was terminated. Afterwards, Andrew was taken to the hospital to be examined, before he was brought back to the police station, charged with assaulting Capon, and bailed to appear in court on June 15th, 5 days after this interview. Despite the biting, Andrew had no previous history of violence, and there was no physical evidence connecting him to Pamela's murder. There was no DNA, no weapon, and no blood found on any of his clothing when tested, despite the violence of the crime. He was insistent that the specifics he'd given about what happened in Flora Metallica were just his theories, and that he was just trying to get into the head of the killer. But what he'd said in the interview was regarded by police as what they called a third-party confession. Andrew Mallard was now their prime suspect. Detectives placed Andrew under covert surveillance. in the hopes that he might lead them to a stash where he kept stolen objects or even the murder weapon, but he just spent his time wandering around the Fremantle area of Perth. 4 days into the operation, he stopped at one of his known haunts, Gino's Cafe. There he struck up a conversation with a man who was reading tattoo magazines, which caught his attention. The man introduced himself as Gary, but Gary wasn't his real name. He was in fact an undercover officer, planted to befriend Andrew in the hopes of gleaning some information. Gary and Andrew quickly became good pals, when Gary accompanied him to bars, bought him 2 nights stay at the Tradewinds Hotel, and even gifted him a bong. During one afternoon, the pair were discussing tools Gary should buy for his truck. Gary mentioned Sidchrome wrenches. Andrew asked, "Sidchrome?" and Gary responded, "Sidchrome all the way." Sidchrome is a known tool brand in Australia, and remember, it was one of these wrenches that Pamela Lawrence thought might have been missing from Pamela's workshop. You might be wondering why I've included this exchange now, but it will become clear later on. Naturally, the conversation was eventually steered towards the murder of Pamela. Andrew gave the same theories he'd given to police, and told Gary he'd been questioned about it because they'd asked for his help. It was now 3 days into the undercover operation, and pretty much nothing had been learned. He made no admissions and didn't lead the officer to any evidence that linked him to the crime scene at all. And to make matters worse, Andrew's behaviour around Gary was starting to become more and more erratic. His use of alcohol and cannabis greatly increased, and he started carrying around a knife that he'd taken from his parents' house. As a result, Gary opted to end the operation due to fears for his own safety. Andrew's bail hearing for biting Capon was supposed to be on June 15th, and this was in the middle of the undercover operation. Police knew his whereabouts at all times, but the undercover officer actively encouraged him not to attend. He didn't, so a warrant was issued for his arrest, a convenient opportunity to haul him in for further questioning about Pamela's murder. On the morning of June 17th, Andrew was again at Gino's Cafe, and the surveillance team notified the major crime squad. At 10:10 am, an unmarked car screeched to a halt right outside the cafe, and officers arrested him and bundled him into the car, where he was driven in silence to the station. He was strip searched and placed into the same interview room he'd been in previously. Andrew Mallard was interviewed by a different detective, Detective Brandon, 3 times over the course of the next 3.5 hours. Only a portion of the last interview was recorded. During these interviews, he made contradictory and inconsistent statements and admissions. He was asked directly if he killed Pamela Lawrence. He said he did, but he didn't mean to. He just needed to keep her quiet. He told Brandon that he took a wrench from Pamela's shed and hit her repeatedly with it, before a young girl in a green sedan spotted him. He said that after he left Flora Metallica, he ran to Stirling Bridge and threw the wrench into the river, before washing his clothes in salt water to confuse any forensic testing. Andrew was asked to draw the murder weapon, and he produced this sketch of a Sidchrome wrench. This was the confession police needed, but Andrew then went on to tell Detective Brandon that he'd made the whole thing up. He'd spun them a yarn based on what he'd heard in the media and from locals around town. He was asked how he knew specific details, and Andrew replied, "Maybe I'm psychic. All the things I told you is what I imagined the killer would have done. I got inside the culprit's head. I got inside the killer's head." Detective Brandon asked if he was prepared to undergo a video recorded interview. Andrew said that he wanted to be recorded so that he could be cleared, but the detective had other motives. He wanted to get a confession on tape.
We brought you in this morning and we had a conversation in relation to the murder of Pamela Lawrence at Mosman Park. Do you agree with that?
I do.
And you told us that you went in through the rear of the shop at Flora Metallica. Is that what you told us?
I told you that.
Okay. I'm just going to go through that now, okay? What you told us. All right, we'll sort the rest out later, okay? You described the steps to us and you described the rear door and the fly screen door.
I did. May I say something else?
Okay, yeah, go on.
If Pamela Lawrence was locking the store up, maybe she came in through the back way, the front door was already locked. Maybe.
Okay. Yep.
And she left the key in the back door, and that's why he had easy access, and that's why she didn't hear him until he was much in the store.
We'll go on with what you told us earlier, okay, before we go into anything else. The fact is that you told us all these things, and you now say that that was a complete pack of lies, that all that things that you told us was...
I say that is my version, my conjecture of the
Of what?
scene of the crime.
Okay, no worries. We'll leave it at that. End of story. Thanks very much.
Police were placed in a tricky situation. Andrew confessed to the murder, but also retracted it. He'd provided details that they thought only the killer could know, but a lot of what he told the detectives was wrong. He incorrectly described what Pamela was wearing, her handbag and her purse. His description of the layout of the shop and the shed at the back were also wrong, as was his description of the car Catherine Barsden was in. Not only that, but Catherine's composite sketch didn't exactly look like Andrew. Since he'd been arrested on the day after the murder, officers had a convenient photo of him taken soon after the crime. A thick, bushy moustache is conspicuously missing from the sketch. This was on top of the fact that much of what he said in the interview was clearly the ramblings of a man with deep psychological issues. He'd also told Brandon that he'd passed through several dimensions. His soul had gone into different bodies, and he carried a small bag around which contained his girlfriend's hair. Andrew Mallard was not a well man, but the confession was enough for police to remand him in custody, and 2 days later, on June 19th, he was formally charged with the willful murder of Pamela Lawrence. It would be a long time before Andrew's day in court. November 1995, 18 months after Pamela was killed. The prosecutor, Ken Bates, presented the case as a robbery gone wrong, that Andrew Mallard had used the storm and the early closing of shops along Glyde Street as an opportunity. He expected to find Flora Metallica empty but was met with Pamela. He panicked and bludgeoned her to death with the wrench. The meat of the case centred around a list of 15 things which only the killer could know. The 30-minute interview tape was played to the jury, and it was presented as a confession. Andrew Mallard protested his innocence throughout the entire trial, at one point turning to Peter and saying, "I did not kill your wife, Mr. Lawrence. I had nothing to do with it." The trial lasted just 2 weeks, and it didn't take long for the jury to deliver their verdict. Guilty. And on December 21st, 1995, the then 33-year-old Andrew Mallard was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 20 years. His last words before being led from the dock were, "I am an innocent man. You have not heard the last of this." Ordinarily, this is where the case would end, but not this one. Andrew's barrister made an appeal to the Supreme Court the following June on the grounds that the unrecorded interview should never have been admitted, and that the so-called confessions were the result of leading questions and cherry-picked responses, and were taken from Andrew when he was in a phase of deep psychological imbalance. This was backed up by the fact that there was a total lack of any DNA evidence or murder weapon, and that it simply wouldn't have been possible for Andrew to have got out of the taxi at 5 p.m, make his way over to Flora Metallica and kill Pamela by 5:02 p.m, when Catherine Barsden spotted the man inside the shop. But all 3 judges voted to dismiss the appeal, and his conviction was upheld. Andrew refused to conform to prison life, refused to attend violence counselling sessions, and refused to refer to the prison officers as his superior. He continued to profess his innocence inside, which would effectively make future parole hearings almost impossible to pass, since remorse is a key factor. He voluntarily underwent prison hypnotherapy sessions in a bid to prove he wasn't guilty. He passed the tests, but it was all futile. Andrew shrouded himself in Buddhist philosophy, yoga, and meditation in order to get through prison life. But as the years went by, his fragile mental health deteriorated, and he became deeply paranoid. He thought he was the victim of some massive cover-up, that everyone was involved, and that the police interviews had actually been brainwashing sessions. But Andrew's family never wavered in their belief that Andrew was innocent. His father Roy dedicated his time to studying law and trying to find flaws in the case against his son. But tragically, Roy was diagnosed with terminal cancer during Andrew's incarceration. He passed away from the disease less than a month later, and when Andrew was informed by his own mother, he didn't believe her. He thought she'd been manipulated into saying it as a means of breaking him down further. But his family fought on. In 1998, they approached a well-known Australian journalist, Colleen Egan, urging her to take a look at Andrew's case. She carefully worked her way through the court transcripts and became convinced Andrew wasn't given a fair trial. But Andrew was in such a low mental state that he refused any help. Colleen advised the Mallard family to get Andrew psychiatric help in prison before they proceed. Eventually the prison agreed, and Andrew was sent to a high-security psychiatric facility for treatment. There, in the presence of nurses and other patients, he started to wake up from the paranoia and the delusions. He was ready for the fight. Colleen continued to work on the case for 4 years. In 2002, she appealed to Attorney General John Quigley for help. He had a formidable reputation, but was an unlikely ally. He'd carved out a long and illustrious career defending police officers for the West Australian Police Union, before turning his hand to politics. But this had given him an invaluable insight into the way homicide cases operate. Quigley agreed to help, and it wasn't long before he came to the same conclusion as Colleen. Certain elements just didn't sit right with him. He began to unpick the threads of the case against Andrew, convinced it was all going to unravel, and he wasn't wrong. But he only had the court transcripts, so he pulled a few strings and was able to get access to the prosecution files. As he looked through, he began to peel away the layers of this case to find it was hiding a lot of secrets. There was a pattern of information that was never disclosed to Andrew's defence, as well as clear cases of evidence that had been manipulated to make him appear guilty. For starters, his defence were never informed of the entire undercover operation. But probably the most crucial thing John Quigley unearthed was a test that officers had conducted and kept from Andrew's defence and the courts. It was a test as to whether a wrench could actually have been the murder weapon. One recognised method of replicating human head injuries is to test various weapons on a pig's head. Not a living one, obviously. And that's exactly what detectives had done on June 24th, when a wrench was tested. The injuries to Pamela couldn't be replicated on the pig with the wrench, which meant that it was almost certainly not the weapon used to kill her. But the prosecutor, Ken Bates, had presented the entire case to the jury on the basis that a wrench was the murder weapon, simply because that's what Andrew had said in his early interviews. During court proceedings, he even called Pamela's pathologist as a witness, but didn't once ask him if a wrench could have caused the injuries. Plus, it was Peter Lawrence who first mentioned Sidchrome, and it was Gary the undercover officer who then brought the name up to Andrew. And since the case against him relied almost entirely on the so-called confessions and the infamous sketch of the Sidchrome wrench he made, the fact that it couldn't have been the actual murder weapon should have thrown doubt across the entirety of his confession. And there was so much more they found. Tests on Andrew's clothing found no evidence of salt, despite his confession suggesting he'd used salt water to wash them. At the request of Detective Sherville, a new report was created, omitting any record of this test. And Catherine Barsden failed to pick out Andrew from a series of photographs. This was never disclosed either. Multiple statements were taken from her, and from a number of other eyewitnesses, and the ones provided to the defence and in trial differed from the originals. The statements eventually provided better corresponded to Andrew's appearance than the originals. What they were doing was treating the evidence and statements like a big buffet, plucking out the juicy portions that incriminated Andrew, and any evidence that contradicted their case against him was simply discarded. They turned a weak case against him into a much stronger one. In light of the new evidence, an appeal was once again brought to the Supreme Court on December 3, 2003. The 3 judges again came to a unanimous decision. Appeal dismissed. Andrew's conviction was upheld. They firmly believed the undisclosed evidence wouldn't have affected the outcome of the trial. But Andrew's legal team weren't ready to give up the fight just yet. Almost 2 more years would pass, but an appeal was finally heard in Australia's High Court in November 2005. This time 5 judges viewed the appeal, and again the decision was unanimous. Appeal upheld. Conviction quashed. A retrial was ordered. It was now up to the prosecution whether Andrew would be retried, but changes in the law in 1995, just a year after his conviction, meant that unrecorded interviews were no longer admissible as evidence. Without this, they had no case. Still, they dragged their feet, and it wasn't until 3 months later, on February 20th, 2006, that the case was formally dropped, and Andrew was released from Casuarina prison after almost 12 years behind bars. On his release, the prosecution said this: "Mr. Mallard's discharge on this charge doesn't alter the fact that he remains a prime suspect for this murder. Should any credible evidence present in the future that would ever give the state a reasonable prospect of obtaining a conviction, the state would seek the prosecution. What a kick in the teeth for Andrew. They might as well have said, "We know he did it, although we cannot prove it." Andrew's release was a heavy burden for Pamela Lawrence's family, who at this point still believed he was guilty, and the burden of the case weighed heavily on him too. He began to suffer panic attacks brought on by PTSD. After all, many still believed he was responsible and was simply let off on a technicality. Being free wasn't enough. Andrew, his family, and his legal team were intent on clearing his name, so they pressed investigators to reopen the case. They agreed, and the Lawrence Homicide Review was allocated to the Special Crime Squad. But if it wasn't Andrew, who did actually kill Pamela Lawrence? Remember the partial palm print that was found inside Flora Metallica? The one that couldn't be checked on the fingerprint identification system? Well, that system was overhauled in 2001, and palms could now be used. And they were. Multiple unsolved cases were resolved using the new database. But in 2001, the murder of Pamela was a solved crime, and so the print was never run through it. But now the case was open again, so the palm print was tested, and it produced an immediate match. Simon Rochford. At the time, Simon, originally from England, was actually an inmate, serving time in Albany Regional Prison. He was in his 11th year of a 15-year sentence for killing his girlfriend, Brigitte Dickens. Brigitte was killed just 7 weeks after Pamela, and Simon was charged with her murder the day before Andrew was charged with Pamela's. Brigitte's death was the result of being struck over the head with a homemade weapon. It was a weight collar attached to a sawn-off hoe handle. The colour of the weapon? Prussian blue. The very same colour paint that was found in Pamela's injuries. Although the actual murder weapon couldn't be found at the time, investigators did uncover this photo of Simon alongside it. The shape and dimensions were consistent with Pamela's wounds, and what they were able to locate was his bag. Inside it were flecks of blue paint that were identical in chemical composition with those found on Pamela. Finally, they knew who killed Pamela Lawrence. But we'll never know why Simon killed Pamela. Details of the case leaked to the media, and he saw a news broadcast that named him as a significant person of interest. The following day at 7:45 a.m. on May 19, 2006, the body of Simon Rochford was discovered in his cell, the result of self-inflicted wounds. The Corruption and Crime Commission performed an extensive inquiry into allegations of misconduct in the case against Andrew. They found that the jury was misled in regards to the 15 things that only the killer could know, because much of the information was in the media, or fed to Andrew in the interviews and via Gary, the undercover officer. The things he did get right were calculated guesses, and would be dwarfed in comparison if police had provided what the Commission described as things that Andrew Mallard got wrong. Regarding misconduct, they said, "The Commission is satisfied that Detective Sergeants Capon and Sherville, who were together involved in the process either by persistent and repeated questioning or by deliberately raising doubts in the witnesses' minds until they became confused, uncertain, or possibly open to suggestion, were instrumental in causing the witnesses to change their statements," and more general descriptions could apply to Andrew Mallard. The Commission has formed the opinion that in conducting the trial as he did, and in failing to disclose to the defence the results of the pig's head testing of the wrench, there was misconduct on the part of Mr. Bates. They believed the findings sufficient grounds to terminate the employment of each of them, but all 3 men resigned before any disciplinary action could be taken. The results of this investigation led to an update in policies regarding the strict disclosure of evidence in 2007. And on October 11, 2006, the Commissioner concluded the cold case review. Andrew Mallard was officially no longer a person of interest in relation to the murder of Pamela Lawrence. A formal apology was given to Andrew for the part police had played in his conviction. In May 2009, he also received a $3.25 million settlement as compensation for taking 12 years of his freedom. Following his release, Andrew made efforts to begin rebuilding his life. He took up painting, graduated from university with a fine arts degree, and moved to London to begin a master's course. and he even got engaged to a woman who lived in Los Angeles. Finally, his life was on track, until this happened.
Good evening. The family of Andrew Mallard, once wrongly imprisoned, say he was engaged and in love when he was killed in a Hollywood hit and run. Those who fought for his freedom say there's some comfort knowing he found happiness as CCTV of his final moments emerged. A warning, the footage has been carefully edited, but the images are confronting.
Andrew Mallard walks casually across Sunset Boulevard, realising only at the last second what's coming. The once wrongly convicted West Australian was killed in the Hollywood hit and run, the silver sedan never once slowing. His final moments captured on security cameras.
Oh, I'm sorry. No worries. I'm a bit upset.
The 56-year-old, who'd spent the past 13 years of freedom rebuilding his life, was in Los Angeles visiting his fiancée.
After losing 12 years for a crime he didn't commit, the remainder of his life was tragically cut short. Andrew Mallard died on April 18, 2019, in a hit-and-run incident while visiting his fiancée in LA. He was 56 years old. Eventually, the driver handed himself into police. Christopher Smith was at the time a 20-year-old basketball player. He was sentenced to 30 days in prison and 300 hours of community service. And that's the story of Andrew Mallard and the murder of Pamela Lawrence. It's one of the saddest miscarriages of justice I've ever heard. If it weren't for the tenacity of Andrew, his family, and the support they got from Colleen Egan and John Quigley, who didn't take a single penny for their efforts, Pamela's family may never known the truth about what happened to her. They now fully accept that it wasn't Andrew who killed her. There were so many opportunities to connect the case of Brigitte Dickens to this one. They happened so close together. Simon Rochford and Andrew even had the same lawyer. Both were interviewed by Detective Brandon, and both victims with their similar and distinctive injuries were examined by the same pathologist. Had the cases been connected, the palm print could have placed Simon Rochford at the scene of the crime right from the start. Andrew wouldn't have lost 12 years of freedom, and Brigitte Dickens' life may not have been horrifically ended in exactly the same manner as Pamela's. And that's it. Thanks so much for stopping by to see me. I appreciate you. Until next time, bye.